Thank you very much. I'm going to steal my guest's best line, which he said, there's fireworks going on outside, we're going to have fireworks in here. Well, let's see. Let's begin with Even Dogs in the Wild, because I haven't read more than about 40 or 50 pages, but without giving anything away, there is a burial, sort of, there's a dead body, and there's a bullet through somebody's window, which is not bad for 30 or 40 pages. I mean, you tell me tell us all a little bit about the book and its gestation, the new John Rebus.
Well, it began with, I mean, people often say, where do you get your ideas from? And in my case, there were a couple of things that started me on this, well, three things started me on this book. One was panic, because I owed my publisher a book, and there was a deadline. Now, I find as a writer that deadlines are stimulating in that they get the adrenaline flowing. So without them, I can't do anything. Second thing was a story I was told in a bar in a little village in Scotland, and I was told of an alleged drug dealer who had died of natural causes, but there was a rumour put about that he had a stash of drugs and money hidden in the woods on the edge of town. And so over the weekend, the villagers would take up shovels and go into the woods and merrily start digging away at random to see if they could uncover any of this stuff. And it sat in my head. It was a kind of mixture of Treasure Island and Whiskey Galore. And you would think it might lend itself to a comedy. That wasn't the way it turned out. But what I did in my book was decided that some gangsters from Glasgow, some very bad people from Glasgow, would be on the trail of somebody who double-crossed them and who had taken a lot of stuff of some description from them and was supposedly in Edinburgh. So they come to Edinburgh to look for him. Now, the fun there is that, of course, if Glasgow gangsters come to Edinburgh, two things happen. One is that Glasgow cops then come to Edinburgh to keep an eye on them, and also the Glasgow gangsters come up against the Edinburgh gangsters. So you get Glasgow cops and Edinburgh cops knocking heads, and Glasgow gangsters and Edinburgh gangsters knocking more than heads. So that was one thing that got me going. The other thing was the panic and the deadline, and the third thing was just that image of a, I don't know how it came to me, I don't know when it came to me, but it was just Cafferty, this guy who's been a gangster, who's been a villain who ran Edinburgh, but he's now retired or semi-retired. And he's in his lovely big Murchison house, which is basically my house. And he's standing in the drawing room, the living room, and there's a big bay window. It's dark outside. He's got the lights on inside, so he cannot see that somebody is standing just outside the window pointing a gun at him. And that was it. It was just an image of somebody pointing a gun at him, and I was thinking, who is that person and why are they doing that? And that was it. And I don't start with much more than that, Gavin. As a rule, I've got usually a very, very slender. I mean, publishers often say, Ian, what's in your book going to be? And I say it's going to be about 100,000 words. I've got absolutely no idea. Until I write the book, I don't know what the book is.
Is that why, one of the reasons why it's compelling to get to the end? Because actually, you're trying to figure out what the ending is.
Absolutely. I know when I start the book, I know as little as my detective. I've got a murder scene, or I've got some kind of crime or some mystery, and the only way that I will get an explanation or to solve it is to go along with the detectives and find out what they find out. So, in fact, there was one book, The Hanging Garden. I think it was a second draft before I worked out who the killer was. And all the way through the first draft, it's just a big kind of chunk saying, I'll fill this in later. I don't quite know what's going on here, but I'll just fill it in later. So the first draft is very loose, very baggy. And it all gets fixed by the third or fourth draft, by which time it looks as though it was always meant to happen like this. But there's always a thrilling moment for me partway through the book where I start to see what the book is about. When I begin, I'm not exactly sure where it's going to go. I mean, there was one book I wrote, it was going to be a trilogy about the Scottish Parliament. 3 books. In book 1, there was going to be a guy who was running to be an MSP, a member of the Scottish Parliament. In book 2, he's elected, and in book 3, the Parliament's up and running. That was the plan. He was dead within 40 pages of book 1. Now, I didn't mean for that to happen. You know, that wasn't supposed to happen. But the book, the narrative, the book, the inner voice said to me, you don't need this guy. You don't need him. Get rid of him. So I had another body on my hands with no idea who killed him or why. Any writers out there, this is not a great way of becoming a full-time writer.
I wanted to talk a bit about my favourite character in your books, Edinburgh, actually. I mean, the whole city of Edinburgh is so resonant throughout the books. We'll get on to John Rebus, of course, which is everybody's favourite character. But the way in which you portray Edinburgh, which is both this very posh city with rather erudite people, gangsters, low life. I mean, it is absolutely all of those things, isn't it? But also this great background. It's an amazing city to write about.
It is an amazing city to write about, and lots of writers are writing about it right now. But when I arrived in Edinburgh in 1978 to go to university, I didn't really know Edinburgh. But I was a writer by then. I was writing poetry and scribbling away in stories and things. And I thought, I've got to write about Edinburgh to make sense of the place, to try and come to some kind of, because that's what I'd always done as a teenager. I was writing about the world to make sense of the world, to have a conversation with the world. And so I started writing about Edinburgh. It just seemed natural to me that I would suddenly write about this place and make sense of it that way. But then I came to an understanding that this was a very complex mechanism. For a very small city, it's a very complex place. As you've alluded to, it has a lot of layers. And a detective is a very good way of looking at every layer of society from the top to the bottom, from the business people, the corporations, the politicians, down to the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the disaffected. One character, a cop, allows you to look at all these different layers and how they connect. At the same time, I was doing my undergraduate degree I specialised in American literature. And then I went out into the cold, hard world of getting a job and didn't like it. So I went back to Edinburgh and spoke to one of my professors. In fact, he wasn't a professor, he was a lecturer. And I said, can I try and do a PhD? And he said, yeah, you can apply to do a PhD, see if you get some funding from the Scottish Education Department. What do you want to do? I said, well, I want to do Thomas Pynchon, the American novelist. He said, well, you won't get money from the Scottish Education Department to do a PhD on Thomas Pynchon at a Scottish university. And I could see a glint in his eye. A guy called Cairns Craig, who's just retired recently, he was a professor. I saw the glint in his eye. I said, well, which writer would I get funding to do some work on? And he said, there's not much on Muriel Spark. And I said, who's she? And he said, Miss Jean Brodie. I said, oh yeah, I've seen the film. He said, well, go away, read. She said she's written 26 books. Go and read her books, see what you think. If you like the idea, do a proposal, let's see. So I duly read her books and loved them, and eventually did get the funding to do a 3-year PhD, at which point I started writing my own books and never finished the PhD. But through studying Muriel Spark, I mean, Miss Jean Brodie is descended from Deacon William Brodie, who was a real character. He was a character, if you go to Deacon Brodie's pub in Edinburgh, they've got the story of him on the outside of the wall. He was a gentleman by day, a member of the establishment, but by night he would break into your house using keys that he had fitted your locks. So him and his mates would break in, hit you over the head and steal your valuables. And he was eventually hanged on a scaffold that he had built, because he was a craftsman, he was a carpenter. Now, in Robert Louis Stevenson's childhood bedroom was a wardrobe made by Deacon William Brodie. So Stevenson, a sickly child, his nursemaid would tell him the story of Deacon Brodie. That wardrobe now is in the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh, a museum dedicated to Scott Stevenson and Robert Burns. So Stevenson subconsciously, at the back of his head was the notion of this real person who was good and bad, who was good and evil, gentleman by day, crook by night, eventually hanged. So he ends up writing Jekyll and Hyde. So through reading Miss Jean Brodie, I get to Deacon Brodie. Deacon Brodie takes me to Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll and Hyde, a novel that should be set in Edinburgh, a very Edinburgh book, but for some reason Stevenson sets it in London. So the first book I wrote, Noughts and Crosses, was supposed to be an updating of Jekyll and Hyde set in contemporary Edinburgh, bringing the theme and the story back. And you're supposed to think that this guy Rebus, who was only meant to be in one book, is possibly the killer. He's got memory lapses, there's a locked room in his flat, all this kind of stuff. Nobody got it. When the book was eventually published, it was published as crime fiction, not as Scottish literature. I was furious. And I would go into the bookshop, Jameston's bookshop in Edinburgh, and take it out of the crime section and put it in the literature section. But nobody got it. So the second Rebus novel was called Hide and Seek and revolves around a club called Hydes, Hydes, in which rich business people go to get their jollies by watching the homeless kids beating each other up. Edinburgh is a Jekyll and Hyde city. Now, every place, every urban environment, anywhere in the world, has a Jekyll and Hyde nature, obviously. But in Edinburgh, it's physically there. The Old Town and the New Town. The Old Town, chaotic, not planned. The New Town, rational, scientific, and everything else. So you've actually got the rational and the irrational in two sides of the city. So you get that yin and yang, or that Cain and Abel, or any of these things. You get it in this structural fabric of the city. And it's a place that in the middle is beautiful. You go there and it seems cultured and it seems like museums and there's kind of traditions and there's statues, but ringed by housing schemes that in the 80s were some of the worst in Europe. Some of the worst housing conditions in Europe, the worst HIV problem in Europe, the worst heroin injecting problem in Europe per capita. The two were not unconnected, the HIV and the heroin. So there were these two cities living inside the same space. And that's why I thought crime fiction was what I would write, to try and explain how these two cities could meet.
The great thing about Rebus you've already touched on, which is like Philip Marlowe, like Nana the prostitute in Zola, like Oliver Twist. He can go conceivably from any layer of society. Does that make part of the job easier, because you then can have plots which go from the top end of Edinburgh society and wider to the very bottom?
Well, it makes it easier and more difficult. I mean, what's difficult is how do you keep it fresh? 20 novels now with this guy. How do you not repeat yourself? I mean, readers to a certain extent and publishers to a larger extent basically want the same book over and over again, just slightly different. But as an author, you want to keep challenging yourself and you want to keep finding new themes and new plots. So you've got the same character. The book can't be remarkably different. It can't suddenly be historical or comedy or a cookbook. You know, I mean, you're writing. You've got a cop in there. It's going to be crime fiction, obviously. So that is there's always that tension. Am I repeating myself? Have I still got something new to say about this guy? And the reason that I keep writing about Rebus is I do keep finding new aspects of his personality that I've not explored yet. And because he lives in real time, he changes. So the guy I wrote about in 1985, when I wrote the first book, who was 39, 40, who's now 65 and retired, these are different characters, very different characters. So I was very conscious of that through this changing man, the fact that he ages in real time, I could talk about the changing nature of society, the way that Edinburgh and Scotland have changed, and just the way that the UK has changed. So there's that. The positives of it are that, yeah, I mean, you can have depth. You get this kind of, I've written millions of words about this guy now. And he, as an outsider, because he didn't grow up in Edinburgh, he's an outsider, he feels like an outsider, and he is a bit of an anarchist. If you're a member of the elite, he's not going to give you a break. If you're a small-time crook, yeah, he might give you a little bit of leeway. But if you're doing this not through economic necessity, but through greed or whatever, he ain't going to help you in any way, shape, or form. And I like that about him. At the same time, he's very much an Old Testament character. He sees the world in terms of good and evil. He sees it in a very binary way. And my job as an author who doesn't see the world like that, but sees it in shades, my job is to sometimes persuade him that the world is not quite black and white the way he sees it, good and evil. So Siobhan sometimes has to say to him, look, there's more to it than that. It's not just that binary world.
Now, we got lots of questions on Twitter, and I'm sure there'll be lots from the audience. But one thing I wanted to get onto before we get into that is, how long did it take you to become an overnight success?
Different for different people, right? I mean, J.K. Rowling, it happened fairly quickly, but even then it was 3 or 4 books. The first Rebus novel was turned down by the first 5 publishers I sent it to, and the 6th took it, but it didn't sell many copies. It was Black and Blue, which was number 7 or 8 in the series, before I won the Gold Dagger for that, which was the best crime novel of the year. And that gave me and my publisher the confidence that we knew what we were doing. It was a further book or 2 before I hit the bestseller lists. So I'd written probably 10 Rebus novels, and in total about 17 or 18 books before I hit the top 10 bestseller list in the UK. And even at that, it was a further couple of years before I was making serious money. So it was a very long, if you think that I started writing when I was 5, trying to do comics, getting little scraps of paper and folding them in half to make little booklets and drawing little stick people in little boxes and sticking free gifts on the front. I started when I was 5 or 6, and then I tried to become a pop star and wrote lyrics for non-existent bands and used to do a top 10 every week, which meant inventing 9 other bands. And I was doing what all writers do. I was playing God. I was recreating the world in a way that was pleasing to me. And I went from that to poetry, and then from poetry to the short story, and from the short story to the novel. When a short story raged out of control and became 30 or 40 pages, I just called it chapter 1 and kept going. That was The Flood. That was my first published book. So yeah, it was a long time, but that's good because that grounds you. I mean, everything grounds you. If you come from Cardendale, where I come from, everything grounds you. Every time you meet your old schoolmates, they ground you. There's no way you're getting to, there's no point in me going back to Cardenden and saying to my old schoolmates, oh, by the way, we made a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Get over yourself, pal.
There is a bit of tall poppy syndrome that's still...
There is. I mean, there's that kind of mistrust of the intellectual, which I'm not sure, I mean, that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I'm not sure that's been great for public life. In Britain or in Scotland, this notion that we mistrust the intellectual.
You're not allowed to say the word intellectual. That's probably a French word, isn't it?
It is, and in fact, probably the greatest Scottish intellectual of recent times, a guy called Kenneth White, had to go to France to do his work.
Well, let me start with a couple of questions that have come in either on Twitter or on email. A couple of quick ones. Do you own a Kindle or an e-reader?
I do own a Kindle, but I haven't used it in years. I do occasionally download books onto my iPad. If I'm going away on tour to the States or Canada, I'll take the iPad with me so I can keep up with emails and stuff. And I might download a few books on there so that I don't have to schlep 5 or 6 books around the world with me. But I still prefer a physical book, and if I go around the world and finish the book, I'll just leave it in a hotel room for the next person. Did that once in a hotel in America, I think. I left a Lawrence Block book in the bedroom. I went back a year later and said, oh, we've got that book you forgot. They'd kept it for a year.
What are you currently reading?
Oh, actually, bizarrely, I'm currently reading a Lawrence Block novel. He's an American crime writer, a book called The Girl with Blue Eyes or something, or Woman with Blue Eyes. It's a very pulpy, very kind of noirish book. I read a lot. I mean, I don't know. I don't read as much. I read about 60, 70 books a year, and I probably listen to about 200 albums a year. So there's a bit of imbalance there. I probably buy 200 albums a year and 50 or 60 books. I just finished reading a really good book by a Scottish author. I'm going to forget her name, Kirsty something, but the book's called Fishnet, and it's about the prostitution trade and...
Fiction or non-fiction?
Yeah, it's fiction. It's fiction, but really well researched. She did go and talk to a lot of escorts and people involved in prostitution. And it's about a sister looking for her other sister who got into the game, and she didn't know this. She disappeared, and she realized that she went into prostitution, and she tries to find her, which leads her into... It's a very political book in a way. It's about, because it's... I mean, it's a hard-hitting book, but very well written, and I really learned a lot about the reasons why people might go into that profession.
There's quite a few questions which I suppose are about people interested in writing their own novels. If you wrote a first novel now, would you look for a traditional publisher, or would you go indie?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, the publishing industry has changed so much since I got into it. It's almost like a different industry altogether. When people ask me that, I really don't know the answer because I don't know enough about e-publishing. I know that a lot of writers now can go direct to the internet and put their wares on Amazon without a traditional publishing deal. The problem with that is it means there's no gatekeepers. There's no editors saying this isn't good enough. And so the public become your barometer. And the books are sometimes badly edited, so there's lots of spelling mistakes, and the line breaks are in the wrong place, and the paragraph breaks are in the wrong place, and that's frustrating as a reader. Even if you've only paid 99p for it, you still want to be, at jars, it takes you out of that world and makes you think, I'm reading a book. I forgot I was reading a book, and now I remember I'm reading a book. So you lose that. But yeah, I mean, in some ways there are more. It's easier now to get published than ever before, but I think it's harder than it's ever been to get noticed and to make a go of it, because publishers tend, the advances to writers are lower than ever before. Well, not lower than ever before, but they're as low as they were in the 80s when I started. And a lot of first-time novelists still don't... I mean, my first novel, The Flood, 200 hardbacks. 200 hardbacks and 600 paperbacks. That was it. Didn't get reprinted. And we're at a stage now where it's still kind of like that for first books. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have stamina, and you've not got to let the bastards grind you down.
But I'm right in thinking, because didn't you chuck in your job and went off to France and ended up doing some other stuff in order to just feed yourself?
No, I mean, I didn't. I mean, when I left university, I mean, the first 3 books the first one was never published. It was a black comedy set in a Highland hotel featuring a one-legged schizophrenic librarian. That one was never published. The second one I wrote was The Flood, and the third one I wrote was Noughts and Crosses. So by the time I left university, by the time I finished my PhD, I'd had one book published, one accepted for publication. My wife had a job in the civil service in London, so we moved to London, or I moved to London to be with her, and she subsidised me for a while. Then I got a job in London as a hi-fi reviewer. I worked in a Middlesex Polytechnic for a while as a secretary. I did anything that would make some money. And then Miranda, my wife, said, look, if you want to be a full-time writer, we can't afford to do it in the southeast of England, let's move to France. And so we found this rundown old farmhouse, and we just moved lock, stock and barrel from Tottenham to the Dordogne. I couldn't speak any French. She did, she spoke French. And it was an extraordinary time, because suddenly the only income we had was from my writing. And so I started writing 2 books a year. 1 rebus novel. No publisher wanted 2 rebus novels a year. So I wrote 1 rebus novel and 1 pseudonymous thriller under the name Jack Harvey for 3 years, just to make enough money to live on. And it was hard, because, I was the breadwinner, suddenly, in a country I didn't understand. So I was sitting in this attic of our farmhouse, surrounded by bus maps of Edinburgh and postcards, and I had a phone book and all the rest of it. And I would just sit and write books about Edinburgh, but sitting there in the Dordogne with a leaky roof.
Do you know, Bernard Cornwell's an old friend of mine, and he tells a very similar story about how they didn't want more than 1 sharp book a year. So he not only started writing thrillers, but he reinvented himself as Sarah Kells and wrote Bodice Rippers.
Brilliant.
Which are actually, apparently, for the bodice ripper market, are great. Let's have some questions from the floor, if anybody would like to start us off. Who'd like to ask a question? Yes, gentleman over there.
And we have roving mics.
We have roving mics.
2
They're
roving
coming
mics.
to you.
That's excellent. This is very professional. Not like any university I've been to before.
Did the portrayals of Rebus, first by John Hannah and then Ken Stott, did they affect the way you understood the character in the later books?
Thanks. No, they didn't, and there's a reason for that. The reason is I've never watched a single episode. No, there's method in that. And what happened, okay, I'm going to keep this as short as I can. The first actor who evinced any interest was Dirty Dan from EastEnders, Leslie Grantham. He and a producer friend wanted to buy the first Rebus novel and transfer it to London. That all fell through. Then the BBC got interested and they approached Robbie Coltrane, but he went off and did Cracker instead. Then it was in abeyance for a while, and then John Hannah had his own little production company. He went to ITV and they said, yeah, we'll do it if you say you'll play Rebus. He didn't want to do it, but they said, we won't make it unless you do it. At which point, yeah, it's going to happen. So I spoke to a few friends of mine who had work put on TV, and they said, well, you can get involved, don't get involved, but it will change the way you write about your characters. Colin Dexter, Inspector Morse, he said, I changed the books. I changed Morse to be more like John Thaw, because I was so enthralled to his characterization. I said, I don't want that to happen. By this stage, I was 6 or 7 books into the series. I didn't want to change my character. One writer I talked to, her work had been televised, and she was so appalled by what they'd done with her main character, she couldn't write about the character again. So I thought, right, I don't want that to happen. So they said, do you want to see a script? No. Do you want to try writing a script? No. Do you want to watch it? No. So I've got all the DVDs, never watched it. Now, fans of the series tell me that Ken Stott is a much better physical match for Rebus. They fought hard to get Ken Stott. When John Hannah packed it in to go to Hollywood, they fought hard because Ken Stott had been in The Vice and he'd been in Messiah. He'd played cops quite a lot, but they eventually persuaded him. And I believe it's quite good. What I didn't like was they took it down from 2 hours on ITV, which is 1 hour and 40 minutes plus ads, to 1 hour on ITV per book, which is 45 minutes. So it was a 45-page script for a 400-page novel. So they were losing nuance, theme, the city couldn't breathe, the characters couldn't develop, it was just... So eventually I got the rights back. So they can't make any more until they persuade me they're going to do it at proper Scandinavian length. The first series of The Killing, 20 hours.
It may be time to introduce the audience to a Scottish word which is thrawn. Thrawn means stubborn.
Yeah, no, I'm not stubborn. I mean, I'm not. I did let them get away with it for quite a long time. You know, and people said to me, you must have been horrified when Dirty Dan wanted to do it. I said, no, I was absolutely thrilled. I thought it was going to be a huge hit on the television. You know, I'd never have to work again. I thought there was huge amounts of money in television. Who knew? Who knew? There's no money in television.
I did. Anybody? A gentleman there.
The man wearing the Hearts top.
Yes, I was going to ask, what is it about my Edinburgh football team that doesn't appeal to Scottish novelists like Irving Welsh or Scottish songwriters like the Proclaimers, or even Scottish crime writers who have characters like Siobhan Clarke. Why are they all Hibs supporters?
Yeah, okay. There are two football teams in Edinburgh. There's Hearts and Hibs. This gentleman supports Hearts. Every cop I know, or at least knew in Edinburgh, supported Hearts. So I decided Siobhan would support Hibs just to wind them up. And that was quite fun. I support Wraith Rovers, which is kind of neither here nor there. But when they decided to film Rebus with Ken Stott, now Ken Stott is a card-carrying, lifelong Heart of Midlothian football fan. The first thing they did was decide to make Rebus a Hibs fan on TV. And they only did it to wind him up. So the first thing that happens in the first episode with Ken Stott is he has to go to Hibernian football ground, the floodlights come on and he looks delighted to be there. And he said in an interview, it's the hardest thing he's ever had to do as an actor. I looked at his CV, I said, Ken, you've played Hitler. He said, yeah, but it was easier to get inside the mind of a mass murderer than to get inside the mind of a Hibs football fan. Anyway. I don't know. The short answer to that is I don't know. I mean, you're right. I mean, the Proclaimers, big Hibs fans, Irving Welsh, big Hibs fans. Me, neither one nor t'other. Neither one t'other. It's not a class thing. I don't think it's a class thing. I don't know what it is. There'll be somebody somewhere out there eventually will come along and have a lovely character who supports Heart of Midlothian. Just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, but it'll be murdered in page 40. You know that's going to happen.
I mean, the problem is that having assiduously kept Rebus out of it by having him support neither one team nor the other, because on TV they've made him a Hibs fan, now whenever I jump in the back of a cab, the cabbie says, why the hell does Rebus support Hibs? He doesn't. The TV writers support Hibs.
I should also add that if you think Hearts fans and Hibs fans don't get on, people from Glasgow and people from Edinburgh. I was born in Glasgow and we moved to Edinburgh, and I have to say that the degree of tension about that is quite significant.
Well, quite a lot of that tension is down to the fact that with this huge structural change in the policing in Scotland, this overarching Police Scotland, this one police authority, which has made life very difficult for crime writers. I mean, I've suddenly got to explain to all the readers who don't know, I've got to explain there's no longer a Lothian and Borders Police, there's no longer a Chief Constable in Edinburgh, we don't investigate murders the way we used to, we don't do forensics where we used to, we don't do cold cases the way we used to. It's all changed. And if I change, I almost did it in this book because I was in the second or third draft when I started finding all this stuff out. I thought, I'm just going to leave it because in a year or two's time, it could all change back again. Because Police Scotland isn't working very well.
Actually, something that I mentioned to you just before we arrived here. I was in an airport and I saw a copy of one of your books, which is called Flesh Market Close. And a close in Edinburgh, if you've ever been, is very... And this Flesh Market Close is very famous, a couple of nice pubs. It was called Flesh Market Alley. What do you think of that?
That's the American edition. It's the only time they've changed the title of one of my books in America, but they changed it because they said readers in America might be put off because they won't know what a close is. The very first thing that happens is Rebus walks down it and opens the door and goes in. So you get some idea it's an alleyway of some sort. It's a street of some sort. But, you know, it's been an ongoing debate, discussion, dispute with my American publisher as to how much they change the English into American English. So, you know, Rebus, you know, if I've got him waking up with a fag in his mouth, that tends not to happen in the American editions of my books.
I'm beginning to see their point, actually.
But you know, he'll go to the trunk of his car, and he'll walk down the sidewalk, and you go, and then the fans get very annoyed because fans are clever people, they're intelligent people, and not only that, but they want local nuance, they want local idiom. They come to these books to get a cultural idea of Scotland and Edinburgh. So the fact that I'm Americanising it for them, they don't like. So it's an ongoing debate with the publisher. And Flesh Market Alley, I do wish they hadn't done it, because it is a real street in Edinburgh, it's just daft. And then American fans come to Edinburgh, they go there, then they come to the Oxford Bar and they say to me, why the hell did you change the name of the street to Close from Alley? I go, well, it's the other way around, actually. But they say how lovely it was. They always say how nice it is that we put the castle right next to the railway station.
Some more thoughts. The gentleman there, we'll get the microphone to you, sir. Get the microphone to you. There we go.
Hello, you have a couple of characters called Holmes and Watson in some of your books, and I like reading Lowe's and Agatha Christie, and a lot of the stories are 10 pages long, and it was put in magazines. Do you think that should be brought back, more magazine the 10-page, 20-page format?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I mean, when I started off, I've said it. I mean, I wrote short stories before I wrote novels, and it's a good process of learning. You learn about concision, you learn about editing, you learn about pacing, you learn about plotting through short stories, without the kind of scary marathon of a novel. You can do all of that. And back when I started, the BBC used to do a story or 2 stories a day on Radio 4. There was morning story and afternoon story. And I put 2 stories in, and they both got accepted. It was a real thrill to get that. Magazines, yep. Newspapers, yep. Used to have short stories. I mean, now we've got the net. I suppose on the internet, there are sites where you could put them up yourself on your own webpage. It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same because you're not getting feedback from an editor. I love short stories, and I wish there were more outlets for them. But it seems like it's getting tighter and tighter. The BBC still do shorts. I mean, I've always been told that the BBC still do short stories. In fact, I was just one of the judges on the BBC short story competition. And the 5 shortlisted entries got put into a book, and they were also all on the radio. And so there is still, but 5 short stories, I think 800 entries. So there are lots of people out there still writing stories, and lots of people who want the short story to flourish. But it needs outlets. It needs outlets. It needs magazines. It needs newspapers. It needs the radio, and also the internet. I mean, the internet is fine because some magazines are internet only now, and that does give you there are lots of places you can look to get your stuff published. But it was very important to me in the early days when I was at university. The very first short story I wrote specifically for a competition run by the Scotsman newspaper, and it was runner-up. It won second prize. And it was about 2 people laid off from a shipyard on the same day. One is working class, one is management, and they meet in a snooker hall. Where it came from, I've no idea. My background didn't come from any there. A year later, having won second prize with that, and it was published in a newspaper, which was great. A year later, I wrote a story for a local radio station, Radio 4. They had a short story competition, and I won first prize. And my prize was presented to me by Peter Ustinov at the Edinburgh Book Festival that year. I think it was 1985. I got a couple of £100 and the story was on the radio. I mean, it was such a buzz. And the other thing is it gives you the confidence to keep going. Writers, even best-selling famous writers still lack a bit of confidence. We keep needing to be told, this is good, keep going.
Well, Howard Jacobson told me that he nearly gave up. And then the next year, he won the Booker.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but yeah. Have you ever felt like that? I can't, I'm not going to...
I mean, no, because I've always wanted to be a writer, and being a writer is the only thing I've ever dreamed of doing. And even if I wasn't successful, I'd be doing it. Even if my publisher stopped publishing me, even if people stopped reading the books, I would still write. Because as I said right at the start, writing is how I make sense of the world. Writing is how I communicate with the world. The books begin with a kind of question or a theme I want to explore. Writing allows me to do that. And it's cathartic. It's therapeutic. Crime writers would be very dangerous individuals if we didn't get all this stuff down on the page. It is very, very therapeutic. It saved me a fortune in psychotherapist fees.
Who'd like to ask our dangerous individual another question? There's somebody up over there. Anybody up at the back that I can't see? Just...
Embarrassing. I'm not a very big crime reader, except for your books and Chandler. And I like very much that I never want the stories to end because of the way you just turn this way and turn that way. I found the same with Chandler. By any chance, is he an influence? Was he an influencer? Is he an influencer? What are your influences, if any?
When I wrote the first Rebus novel, I hadn't read any crime fiction. I was reading, contemporary fiction, and I was reading 19th century Scottish novels and all the rest of it. I wasn't reading crime fiction. Maybe with 1 or 2 possible exceptions, but I wasn't a fan of the crime genre. And then when the first book was published and went into the crime section in the bookshops, I thought, I've become a crime writer by accident. So I did start to read a lot, and I read Chandler as part of that, because I preferred the American model. I like my crime fiction to be quite dark and urban. And although there's a lot of that in the English crime novel, traditionally there wasn't. Traditionally it was Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and Margie Allingham. And there were books about sort of gifted amateurs who would do a job the police couldn't do. The police were seen as being kind of forelock tugging flunkies almost. The Lestrade kind of cop. But later on, the estate of Raymond Chandler gave me a lot of money to go to the States. I won the Chandler Fulbright Award. And so I became a huge fan of Chandler almost overnight. But I was influenced by people like Lawrence Block, his private eye novels featuring a guy called Matt Scudder, who's an alcoholic. They were a big influence on me. James Elroy, when I realized that Elroy's books, as well as doing an alternative history of the USA, he was also using real characters and real crimes. When I was writing Black and Blue, which revolved around a real-life serial killer in Scotland called Bible John, who was never caught, that was an influence. The fact that he had done that, I thought, oh, I can do that. You're allowed to do that. It doesn't have to be just fiction. So all these people were influences on me. And I think you're always influenced. I think you continue to be influenced. But, I grew up with things like The Sweeney on TV. And The Sweeney was as big an influence as anything else. And comics, the pacing in comic books was as big an influence as anything else. That was how I learned storytelling, through comics and through TV. And, Rebus probably owes something to Reagan in The Sweeney, as much as he owes to any other character.
That makes me think, do the words genre fiction have any meaning for you? Do you care about...
They do, but only if we allow in this room that literary fiction is also a genre. If you allow me that, then I'm quite happy with it.
I'll allow you anything.
What I'm finding is, in fact, the crime novel just won the Booker Prize this year, and Marlon James says he was influenced by a lot of crime writers, including James Elroy. And, he makes no bones about it. The Booker Prize have decided it's literary fiction, fine, but he says it's a crime novel. And so do a lot of us. No, the only thing is that it was, in the early days, I suppose, it meant a kind of lesser form, didn't it? Genre fiction isn't quite literary, so it's not as good as literary fiction. But we've come through that, I think, in the UK. Other countries came through that a long time ago, but now, you can study genre fiction at some universities. People are doing their MLits and MSCs and PhDs on crime fiction. People are doing their essays and their English A-levels on my books. So when the universities and the schools say to people it's okay to read this stuff, then suddenly it's okay to read that stuff.
Well, that brings me on brilliantly to a couple of other questions. One is, how important do you think it is to have a university-educated background in the ability to write a successful fiction that has popular appeal? And another, which is perhaps exactly the opposite, how far is academic study actually the enemy of literary creativity?
Oh, man.
You take whichever one of those you like.
Having...
Be careful.
Yeah, no, in my last year as an undergraduate and in my 3 years doing postgraduate, I fell into the wormhole of literary theory. Deconstruction, post-structuralism, hermeneutics, you name it, I went for it, big time. Nightmarish. I'm amazed I ever wrote another word. Because it makes fiction seem quite dry. It makes it seem scientific, or it tries to make it seem scientific, tries to make study seem scientific. When you read a book, there should be an alchemy, a magic between you and the book. Never mind the author. The author is secondary to all of this. But the reader in a book, there's a magic between the two of you. There's a sprinkling of fairy dust. It takes you out of yourself, it takes you out of your existence and into another world. And all the theorizing I'd been reading about didn't seem to take that into account at all. So I had to kind of relearn the magic of reading. Now, I know people that were at uni with me who, after they left university, never read another serious book, serious in inverted commas. Some of them went off and read Mills and Boon and nothing but. Good for them. But I grew up with kind of popular fiction in film and TV. That was what I grew up with. I didn't grow up reading the greats. And so it was nice to come back to popular fiction. You can call it populist fiction, fiction that has to appeal to a wide public because nobody's paying for it to be published and nobody's subsidising it.
Dickens would understand every single thing that you've just said.
Absolutely. And to me that was an important thing. Now, do you need a university education? Of course not. Some of the best writers in the world didn't go to university. Does it help you? Does it hinder you? I don't know. If you're going to be a writer, you're going to be a writer, whatever happens. Whatever obstacles are put in the way, whatever help you're given along the way, you're a writer at heart. And, if you've had somebody like, let's think of an example if I can. I'll try and think of somebody who hasn't been to uni and has done really well. There's loads of them. But, it didn't help me. It didn't help me, but it didn't hinder me. I'd always just wanted to be a writer.
Irvine Welsh, I don't think, went to university, did he?
He went to college, I think, to a certain extent. I'm trying to think. Martina Cole is a fantastic example of somebody who had a proper working class background and just got ideas for stories. And, 99% of the time she wouldn't have made it because she would have gone into the slush pile and it was the publisher slush pile, you know, books that are just sent to them on spec, they don't know are coming in. Ian Banks, his first novel, The Wasp Factory, went into the slush pile. The fact it was plucked out was luck, you know? And as I said, you know, my first book, I went to 6 publishers, and the first 5 turned it down. The first Rebus novel. I just got lucky. And there's an element of luck. There is an element of luck and the zeitgeist, writing the right book at the right time. But I've talked about magic and alchemy. It's the same for publishing. I was at a publishing party last night where we're all talking about the fact that a book like Gone Girl comes along. Nobody knows it's going to be a success. Harry Potter. Who wants to read about wizards at private school in the 21st century? Nobody knew. There's a recent book called Girl on a Train, and publishers they scratch their heads and go, we didn't see it coming. We didn't see it coming. And that's the excitement and the beauty of publishing as well, is that you never know where the next big thing is going to come from, and you never know who's going to read it.
Some more thoughts? Anybody? Yes, this gentleman over there.
Not only do we have your wonderful books, but many others, and most of our televisions are full with lots of gruesome, foul murders. Have you ever thought about the psychology of why a relatively civilized country enjoys dwelling on murder?
Yes, it's because we're a civilized country. You know, I mean, crime fiction is about a very basic question. Why do human beings keep doing bad things to each other? I mean, keep doing bad things per se, but keep doing bad things to each other. What is it about us? What is it about our society? Is it society? Is it the structure of society? Is it capitalism? Is it the fact that we've really only come 2 steps from the cave? That we really are still very basic animals at heart? Is it down to the 7 deadly sins? You know, was the Bible right all along? And the things that cause us to murder each other are basically the 7 deadly sins. What is it? It's an endlessly fascinating question. And P.D. James, I think it was, who said it usually is murder, because murder is the most extraordinary crime, the most heinous crime. It's the taking away of something unique from the world. Somebody nicks your computer, you can buy a new computer. Somebody smashes into your car, you can get a new car. You can't produce a replica of the life that's been taken away. So we're fascinated by that. And I think we're fascinated by good and evil. You know, these very basic concepts. I was going to do a TV series quite a few years ago on Channel 4, about crime. I was approached to do a TV series on crime. And when I talked to the producer about it, we kept coming back to good and evil. And we said, what do we mean by evil? And it ended up being a 3-part series on Channel 4, which nobody saw, about evil. And in Programme 1, we spent months on this. Programme 1, we said, what do we mean? Does it have any usefulness as a concept? Does evil mean the same thing to different cultures and different times in history? Programme 2, where does it come from? Nature, nurture. What makes people do bad things? And Programme 3, what do we do about it? What do we do about the problem of evil? And at the end of that extraordinary series where I interviewed a guy on death row in Texas, I was exorcised by the chief exorcist of the Diocese of Rome, I spoke to psychiatrists, people that worked in Broadmoor, you name it, I did it. At the end of it, I was no nearer pointing to a person and saying that person is irredeemably evil. I could look at an act and say that was an evil act. But I think with the possible exception of Ian Brady, it's very hard for me to look at a person and say that person is irredeemably evil. So it was, but you know, at the end of it, but all that drip fed into the books eventually. And crime fiction asks us very big moral questions of ourselves. And I think that's the enduring fascination of it. And at the same time, if you want to go to a city in the world, anywhere in the world, any country in the world, look at the crime fiction set there, because it will tell you the culture, the society, the economics, the problems they've got, the history, everything will be in the crime fiction. So it's like a primer for visiting places as well. And it's a roller coaster ride. You don't realize you're getting all this information, or you're being asked all these big moral questions because you're enjoying the ride. So it does an awful lot. It's a kind of TARDIS. Each crime novel is a TARDIS. It's bigger on the inside than the outside. That's why we keep reading it. And that means that young writers are coming along, because young writers now see that, and because there isn't the stigma there used to be, because it isn't seen as being just a secondary literary form, young writers are coming on board now, bringing all kinds of big ideas with them and replenishing the genre.
Couple more thoughts. There's somebody at the back there.
Love your books. How important is it to you for you to be reasonably accurate about your street map of Edinburgh? And how many places have you invented there?
Well, back at the very beginning, I thought fiction had to be fictional. So Rebus worked out of a fictional police station and a fictional street and drank in fictional pubs. And then people in Edinburgh would say, well, that's obviously that police station, that's obviously that pub, that's obviously that street. I said, why am I making it difficult on myself? So I burnt down his fictional police station. I moved him into a real police station, St. Leonard's. No, the problem with that became, the problems with writing about the real world became manifest quite soon when a cop phoned me up and said, Ian, the CID at St. Leonard's is getting shut down. You're going to have to move Rebus. So the real world took it. So I moved him in, I named his street Arden Street, which is a street I lived in when I was a student and when I invented the books. In real life, cops wouldn't live there. It's all students. He works in a real police station. I started to work in a succession of them because they keep changing the parameters. And then I mentioned the Oxford Bar where he drinks. And so Rebus fans from all over the world now come into the Oxford Bar looking for him and are sadly disappointed when they find me there and not him, not the dark, brooding, difficult, awkward individual, but me, who's quite happy to see them. Unlike the barman who hates visitors, hates tourists, Harry the guy. Anyway, so it was important for me eventually to get it right because I realized at one point the books were a hobby. I was writing when I was a student. Then the books became a full-time job, and suddenly I was making a lot of money from telling lies about real people and real professions. So I thought I owe it to all these people to get the facts of their jobs as accurate as I can and to make the city as accurate as I can. Now, if I want a really bad thing happening, a rundown estate full of drug addicts, I'll usually invent it. I'll call it the Garibaldi estate or something. Pilmuir. Pilmuir is Pilton and Muirhouse put together, two fairly rough areas of Edinburgh. Because I don't want to diss people who are living in those areas and trying their best to make them nice places to live. So I'll usually, and if there's a dodgy pub, in some of the book, a couple of recent books, it doesn't exist. It's in an area of Edinburgh that is geographically recognisable, but you couldn't point to a pub and say that's where you mean. Same thing happened to me when I set a book 2 books ago. I set a book in the Black Isle. I've got a house up in the Black Isle, which is up past Inverness, and I go there and do a lot of writing there because it's got no internet access, no mobile phone signal, and we've got no TV. I get a lot done. It's also got a great pub. But when I went up there every year, people would say, why don't you set a book here? So 2 books ago, I set a Rebus novel up in the Black Isle and had terrible things happening. I went up to somebody and said, why did you have such terrible things happening in the Black Isle? Because you asked me to.
We've just got a few minutes left. There's a couple of other questions that come in. One that I think is very interesting, actually. But how do you manage that constant feeling that a piece of writing can still be improved on? I mean, maybe the deadlines help.
No, that's true. I mean, as soon as you read a piece of, as soon as you read it, you think, I want to change that. But you can't. I mean, it comes out very difficult. The most difficult time in the process, I think, is when you show, and this has been true throughout my career, when you show the piece of work to somebody. Now, who do you show it to? I mean, in some cases it's going to be an editor, but it might be your wife or your husband, your partner, your friend, somebody who reads a lot of books. You think, is that any good as a book? When you show it to them and you get the feedback from them, that's crippling. If they've got any comments to make that are derogatory in any sense. And like reviews, I never read the reviews of my books, but when I used to, if it was a glowing review but there was one criticism, the only thing I remembered was the criticism. Now, that can be useful because then you don't make that mistake. If it's a mistake you've made or something you don't like somebody said to me once, they said, you mention every car in your books is red. Well, ever since then, there's never been a red car in any of my books. But yeah, I mean, that kind of showing your work to people is tough. The first person sees, my editor never sees anything. My editor gets a title and maybe a couple of lines of what I think the book's going to be about. But the next thing they see is the 3rd or 4th draft. By then, the first draft nobody sees. The first draft is very loose and baggy and very quickly written. And it's full of big gaps saying, I'll fill this in later, I'll do the research. Between first and second drafts, I go and do the research. The bulk of the research I don't do until I've written the first draft, which saves a lot of time. Because by then I know what I need to know, not what I thought I needed to know. And then I'll usually do a 3rd draft, which is very much a polish, and then I'll show it to my wife. So she sees 2nd or 3rd draft, and she reads a lot of crime fiction. She reads a lot of books, but she reads a lot of crime fiction, and she'll say, I don't understand why he goes there, I don't understand what's happening, I don't like this character. I'll tweak it. So by the time my editor sees it, I'm reasonably confident it's a reasonably good book. Now, the editor might still want some changes, the proofreader might still want some changes, the American editor might want some changes, but I'll fight my corner by then because I think this is, you're making it a different book. you're not necessarily making it a better book. I'm going to tell a story very quickly because I love telling a story. When Rebus came back, because Rebus was retired for 5 years and had written other books, and then I found a reason to bring him back, which was a cold case. And I called the book Standing in the Man's Grave. Standing in the Man's Grave is a misheard song lyric from a mate of mine called Jackie Leaven, who died just as I was beginning to write the book. I said to my publisher, I've got a great idea for a book, I've got a great title, it's going to be Standing in the Man's Grave. He said, oh no, it's far too long. Don't call it that. Think of something else. So I went away and did some research. I went back to him and I said, John, it's got exactly the same number of letters as The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. A book he had turned down.
Oh.
So it was like a dagger to his heart. So he said, okay, you bugger, you can have it, okay. So it was a big success, went to number 1. So the next book, he said, Ian, your next book, I don't care what it is, Rebus or non-Rebus, can it have a nice big long title, please? So that was Saints of the Shadow Bible, which is another Jackie Leaven lyric, and this one is Even Dogs in the Wild, 5 words again, and it's a title of a song by an 80s Scottish band called The Associates. Associates, fronted by a guy called Billy Mackenzie, the most extraordinary voice in popular music, had a very unhappy life. He went in for a meeting with his record company in London. He was living in London at the time, and they said, Billy, I'm sorry, we're going to have to dump you. Your records aren't selling anymore. He said, oh, guys, I'm devastated. Can you just get a car to take me back home? I said, yeah. So as a gesture, they got me a really nice big chauffeur-driven limo, turned up at the record company, jumped in the back and said, take me to Dundee. So that was his final act of revenge on his record company.
Ian Rankin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin.